Welcome to this historic evening. On behalf of Gwendolyn Miller, President of the League of Women Voters of Delaware, I am thrilled to tell you that we are looking back, looking ahead, and remembering how precious is the franchise. We'll be hearing about the struggle, and I hope that we'll all be looking forward to the next several years. I'm Kathleen Baker, First Vice President of the League of Women Voters of Delaware. Thank you all for taking your valuable time in person and by Zoom to be with you. I'd like to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the League of Women Voters of Sussex County, Browse About Books on Rehoboth Avenue in Rehoboth Beach, your independent bookstore, Delaware Humanities, the vibrant state-based program of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and of course, the Center for Learning in Cape Henlopen area, Lewis Library. And our eminent women who are here this evening. Anne Boylan is Professor Emerita of History and Women and Gender Studies at the University of Delaware. A social historian of the United States, she is the author of scholarly articles and 4 books, most recently, Votes for Delaware Women. Marlene Saunders is former department chairperson for the Department of Social Work at Delaware State University. Her work has focused heavily on redressing racism and injustices that marginalize minority populations and women. Anne and Marlene, thank you for your body of work and for your presence this evening. Dr. Boylan, the table is yours.
Thank you, Kathleen. And first, I'd love to thank Marlene for agreeing to do this as a little conversation between the two of us. Thanks, of course, to the Lewis Public Library and the League of Women Voters of Delaware. You do fantastic work. Gwen Miller, who was here briefly but is going back to her bed of pain, I'm afraid. Browse About Books, and Delaware Humanities. And of course, I should thank in particularly Kathleen Baker and Rebecca Lowe. They're kind of a dynamic duo. If you ever need somebody to meticulously plan an event, they're your people. So we talked to each other about how we're going to do this, and we're going to do it as a conversation. So I'm going to let Marlene kind of set the agenda for what we're going to talk about this evening.
Thank you, and welcome all. I am so pleased to have the opportunity to do this, though I must admit that when I was first approached about interviewing Anne, I was a little intimidated. You know, it's something else, you know, to be in the presence of someone, so accomplished, and she's just such a good human being. But as I thought about it, we're talking about history and a subject about which we need to talk in order to know what happened, in order to know what we need to do, not to repeat, mistakes that this history about which we're going to discuss shows. The other reason that talking about the journey on the part of women to get the right to vote is that history is in us. And one of the things I did was to recall some poignant words that James Baldwin uttered. And he said, and I quote, "History is not the past. It is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history." And as Anne and I, talk about her book and the history of women getting the right to vote, you'll see some evidence of the past that is with us. That is with us today. I have the pleasure of asking Anne questions, and from her answers, we will learn a lot. So I'm going to begin with the first question. Did everybody have a chance to read the book? Okay, okay, it's a good read, right? Okay. First question.
Mhm.
Why was Delaware so resistant to women getting the vote? And why did they not ratify? And why did they not ratify the right to vote
Mhm.
when they did? Why did it take them so long to do that? In other
Okay,
words.
crucial question, and maybe I can set the scene a little bit. Delaware had several opportunities to change its state constitution to provide voting rights for women. It turned them down each time. But then the really crucial moment came in the spring of 1920, March 1920. 35 states had ratified the 19th Amendment, which provided, of course, nationwide voting rights in theory. And the Delaware legislature was meeting in special session starting on March 22nd, 1920. Delaware could be the final state to ratify. First state could have become the final state. It didn't. The Delaware Senate did ratify the amendment, but the House adjourned in early June without ratifying. So the question is really a crucial one because many suffragists thought that Delaware was the kind of state that would put the amendment over the top. And as you know, many of you, I think that Tennessee became the final state in August of 1920. Suffrage leaders really thought this was the right state. They had a pro-suffrage governor, Governor Townsend, and the Republican Party, which at that time was the party, and I should stress at that time, was the party of civil rights, freedom, the party of Lincoln, and it was strongly behind the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. And the Republican Party had dominance in both houses of the legislature in Delaware. So it seemed as though Delaware would be the place to do it, but it didn't. Why it was not willing to ratify, I can give a few short answers. First, there was a very strong anti-suffrage group in the state, both in the legislature and in the state itself. There was a group of anti-suffrage women who had organized and were very, very insistent in their dealing with members of the legislature. The arguments that they used against women having the right to vote focused on a lot of things, and I can talk about some of those. But the main focus in the spring of 1920 was a fundamentally racist argument. And that was one of the things that doomed the amendment in the Delaware legislature. Legislators and anti-suffrage women said that if women got the right to vote, then Black women would have the right to vote. And it was not unheard of for state legislators in Legislative Hall to fling around racist slurs about Black voters. And at least one major suffrage leader, Mary Wilson Thompson, a very wealthy woman from Greenville, Delaware, she wrote to the governor about what she called the menace of the Negro vote. So that was one of the key elements in making legislators unwilling to ratify. Now, I should point out something here that may not be clear to everybody. The 1897 Delaware State Constitution had restored the voting rights of most Black men. They had been taken away during and after Reconstruction, but the 1897 restored them. So Black men were voting in Delaware. In fact, there was a Black male city councilman in Wilmington elected in 1901, and then another one following him in 1913. So these legislators were very, very clear that if women as a category got the right to vote, Black women would be voting. Now they believed that Black women would vote Republican. So it really raises the question of why Republicans would not want to endorse this. But here's the other element, and I know this is going to surprise you, so be prepared. There was political infighting in the Republican Party in 1920. There were people who were opposed to the governor. The governor was pro-suffrage. Okay, then I won't vote for it. There were people in Sussex County, and Sussex was a real bastion of anti-suffrage sentiment. There were people in Sussex County who were furious about a new school code that had passed in 1919 that required raising taxes and that required providing state funding for Black schools. And so, and there were also people who ran large farms who did not want to have to pay the higher taxes and didn't want their kids to be going to school for a longer period of time because they wanted them working in the fields. So that was also part of it, and that became part of the Republican infighting. But I would say probably one of the other crucial elements that we have really not paid much attention to is that Delaware's legislature was extremely mal-apportioned. In other words, something you may hear about these days, it was gerrymandered. There was no such thing as one person, one vote. No such thing as, my vote counts the same as your vote. No. The legislature was set up so that, to take one example, Sussex had 20% thereabouts of the state population, but 30% of the seats in the House. And remember that Sussex was a bastion of anti-suffrage sentiment. So Sussex voters had an outsized influence in the legislature. So you kind of put all those things together and you begin to see how, as a mass of things, they doomed the effort in Delaware, and the leaders who had come here from the national associations all moved on to Tennessee, where they were successful.
Okay, thank you. Now, are you beginning to connect dots from the past to the present? Okay, okay. If you were like me when you started reading the book, you had to get out a pen and you had to get out a piece of paper and you had to start writing names of organizations and you had to start writing acronyms.
Mhm.
And then as you read the book, there were these factions, that had priorities, and agendas. So my question to you is what was that all about?
Mm.
How did those factions impede or advance the movement towards the passage of the 19th Amendment? And how were those dynamics manifested in Delaware?
You're right about all the acronyms and trying to keep them all straight. There were two major national organizations, mostly of white women, that were founded in the 1860s. And then they came together in 1890 to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association. The individual organizations within it sometimes had Black members, but it was very largely a white organization. Then in the 1890s, 1895, the National Association of Colored Women was founded. And so Black women's interest in voting particularly focused on working through the National Association of Colored Women, the NACW. But the big sort of split within the National American Woman Suffrage Association was about strategy and tactics. Black women were clear almost from the start that they favored a federal amendment to the Constitution. They did not want to shilly-shally and go around with the states and state by state by state, which was the strategy that was used mostly in the 1890s by the NAWSA. They wanted an amendment that would look like the 15th Amendment, which had given Black men the right to vote, okay? But within the National American Woman Suffrage Association, there were people who wanted to work for both at once. So we should work for state level suffrage and we should also work for a federal amendment. But until about 1910 or 1914, the federal amendment was kind of on the back burner. So you get state by state efforts to get women voting rights. And in Delaware, they start in 1897. The Delaware Equal Suffrage Association tries to get the state constitution to include the right to vote for women. No. Then 1909, 1911, 1913, 1915, 1917, they approach the state legislature for a statewide amendment. And you have to remind yourself that the legislature met every other year. So they would have to pass the statewide amendment for 2 legislative sessions with, I think it's 3/4 of the vote. So it was a heavy lift. So the shift to focusing on a federal amendment really comes with the creation of an organization called the Congressional Union that became the National Woman's Party. Then you begin to see splits within these organizations, and it was very evident in Delaware. The Delaware Equal Suffrage Association was a more sedate organization. The National Woman's Party, they were what we call the militants. They're the kind of people who picketed the White House, burned Woodrow Wilson's words in what we call them fire pits today. They call them, now I'm blanking on the word, but anyway. And so you have these switches where by the time you get to about 1914, everybody says, okay, we really should focus our energies on the national federal amendment, but they can't agree on tactics. Are you alienating politicians by picketing the White House? Are you annoying Woodrow Wilson? Well, sure you are. He can't get to his golf game without passing by the people picketing. And once you have these watch fires, what they call it, once you have watch fires outside the White House, people are being arrested, women are getting arrested, they're getting dragged off to jail. The National Women's Party, led by Alice Paul, saw in that an opportunity to call attention. You know, if you can be in people's faces with your picketing and your lobbying, you get a lot of attention. You also get a lot of pushback. So there are these divisions. And all the way along, African-American women participated when they could. But, and here's one of the divisions that I think you're really getting at. By the late 1890s, many white suffragists from the former Confederate states had joined the National American Woman Suffrage Association, and they wanted white women only suffrage. Those ex-Confederate states had disfranchised Black men, starting in 1890 until 1905, just wiping out their right to vote, even though it's in the Constitution. And they did it by all the techniques you know about poll taxes and the 8-box system and registration systems that are, you know, you have one registration day per year and it's 40 miles from where most Black people live, that kind of thing. So Southern white suffragists did not want Black women voting. And so they, when they came into the organization, they forced the organization to think, well, what will our position be? And in 1903, in New Orleans, Louisiana, at their annual conference, the National American Woman Suffrage Association basically said, we'll abide by what the states do, which is a betrayal of Black suffragists, because it means that if women get the right to vote in nationally, Mississippi can still disfranchise Black women by the same way they disfranchise Black men. So Delaware is a little different because Black men are voting. And there is a very vibrant group of suffragists in Wilmington, the Equal Suffrage Study Club. But even in Delaware, the issue of Black women's voting meant that white women often tried to just keep Black women at arm's length. There are some examples of a few tentative touches across the race line, mostly by Black women inviting white women to come into Black-owned and Black-run spaces like the Garrett Settlement House in Wilmington. So you have these divisions you're talking about, and they have to do with strategy, tactics, but race is often at the center of these kinds of divisions.
Thank you. You just mentioned how race is often, you know, the center, you know, of the division, you know, that we see between white suffragists and Black suffragists, and why Delaware, you know, ultimately did not ratify the amendment. But you also talk about an attitude, a general attitude toward women. Can you talk with us, you know, about that and how that helps to explain why it took so long, you know, to get the 19th amendment? So that's two questions.
And actually, you know, I think it's useful also to point out, I mean, there's no question that we should call out the racism of white suffragists, but it's also worth remembering that that was often in response to the even worse racism of anti-suffragists who were very blatant about it. But sure, you know, when you think about the arguments that anti-suffragists in general made and anti-suffrage legislators made, they had a particular view of women. And it was usually women like my wife and my mother and my daughter, not the woman who works in my kitchen or who washes my laundry or whatever. So they often talked about how women are more peace-loving than men. And some suffragists made that argument. You know, if women ran the world, there would be no war. Well, let's think of Golda Meir, shall we?
Mhm.
And so there's that, but there's also this notion that men protect women, and that if women are voting, they will lose the protection of men. They will go off to vote, becoming independent, thinking about whom they want to vote for, and suppose they come back home and they voted differently from their husband. Well, the next thing you know, you've got divorce court, and the family is being, broken up. There was, and I think this is a reminder, and this is what I think what you're getting at too, Marlene.
Mhm.
There's a way in which women having the right to vote is really quite a radical political demand.
Mhm.
And we don't want to forget that. It's a radical political demand for women to be asking or to demand, we want the right to vote. And so some people really imagine that if women were voting, you would have a complete role reversal.
Mhm.
Men would be home with the apron on
Mhm.
and the babies and the cat to feed and the garbage to take out and the laundry to do. And their wives would be striding off to the polls with their practical little hats, and they would be, doing whatever they wanted to do, and they'd just be too independent. So the idea that it would destroy the traditional patriarchal family strikes us as kind of nuts, but it was something that they cared about a great deal. Something else that might strike us as nuts was people thought that women voting was socialistic. I mean, after all, the Russian Revolution is 1917.
Mhm.
Women in the new Soviet Union can vote. Ergo, voting for women is socialist. And if women can vote in the United States, they'll bring socialism to us.
Mhm.
And again, this sounds kind of nuts to us, but it was something that really emerged in this kind of political discourse, in the notion that women voting would be a radical remaking of families
Right.
and marriages.
And what do you think about this? This is the thought that's coming to my mind, and I think that is pertains to both Black women, even though we have the color issue and what you just talked about. And it has to do with what voting means in terms of changing the hierarchy of
Exactly.
men, to women. So that what voting represented was a shift in power.
Exactly. And part of that, of course, is a way to remind ourselves that women were already voting in a number of states. By 1920, women had full voting rights in 15 states. They had the right to vote for president in 13 more states. They had full voting rights in the Alaska Territory. So you might think, well, let's use some logic here. Let's use some political argumentation. Women are voting in California, and they're voting in Illinois. Ida B. Wells is voting in Illinois. They're voting in New York, starting in 1917. What's the problem?
Mhm.
But when you're talking about power and changing power relations, fear will overcome all the time. And so people are not, and again, I know you'll be surprised to hear this, people are not necessarily amenable to logical argumentation. Their fears,
Continue to connect the dots, the past to now.
fear will often overcome all of these things. So yeah, I mean, they may have noticed people voting, women voting in other states, and thought, but they didn't think that. They were still fearful of this power differential being destroyed. So, and that was true in Delaware. The fear mongering, and particularly fear mongering focused on Black women,
Mhm.
was rampant during the legislative session.
Mhm. Well, let's talk about Black women, Black sisters, and how does their priorities, their strategies compare
Mhm.
And contrast
Right.
To the white suffragettes, as
Yeah.
some people use that term, suffragettes.
Right. Suffragette was considered kind of insulting in the American context. It was a British term, so we use the term suffragist.
Yeah, right.
But I think I've already sort of made a little hint at this. For Black women, the right to vote was a way to achieve both gender justice and racial justice. And you see it in Delaware, and if you read the book, you'll see it here. Black women saw voting rights as something that would achieve a broader set of goals for them and for their communities. So they, for example, were especially interested in improving this educational and schooling system in the state, which was required to be segregated by the 1897 Constitution. So they believed that if they had voting rights, if you have the right to vote, a legislator has to listen to you. They don't have to listen to you if you're just, one of those non-voters out there. They thought they could use their voting rights to improve the schooling situation for Black kids, to improve the salaries and pensions for Black teachers. Beyond that, they saw voting rights as helping to dismantle the system of gender injustice and racial injustice that they faced every day of their lives. And one of the biggest issues for Black women voters throughout the United States was to get a powerful federal anti-lynching bill. And you may not know this, but there was a lynching in Newcastle County outside Price's Corner in 1903. George White lost his life. Witnessed by, they think, a crowd of about 3,000 people. It wasn't just in Mississippi, it wasn't just in Alabama. And then, of course, in those states, Black women believed that if they had the right to vote, they might be able to restore the voting rights of Black men. That was not an issue in Delaware, but it was something that many Black women in the National Association of Colored Women thought might happen. So you find in 1920 in North Carolina, in Virginia, in Florida, Black women registering and voting until the registrars caught on and said, oh, we can disfranchise you on the same basis that we disfranchise Black men. So all of those things point to a very large platform that Black women cared about. Now, white women who wanted the right to vote, they were definitely interested in a platform of gender justice in particular. They believed that they could use their votes to improve conditions for children, for women, to support laws that would help to improve maternal and child health. For example, the Shepherd-Towner Act 1921, because America's infant mortality rate, it's still pretty dreadful, as I'm sure most of you in the league know, but it was really appalling back in 1919, 1920. White women also believed that their votes would enable them to work on issues of social welfare. A juvenile court, for example, was something that they cared about. But it's a platform in which they want the rights of citizenship to be fuller. It's just not as expansive as, I would say, visionary as that of Black suffragists. And maybe this would be a good point to show a few of the pictures, because Marlene made this suggestion. I thought it was a great suggestion that people might like to see, who are we talking about here in terms of Black suffragists? Now, I chose about 10 slides. Most of them are, and this comes back to the point about connecting to today. These are people who we are now going to commemorate or are commemorating through historic markers or monuments in the state of Delaware. Okay, so let's start with Delaware Suffrage Leaders. Okay, Alice Dunbar Nelson, Alice Ruth Moore Dunbar Nelson. Okay, Alice Dunbar Nelson was born in Louisiana. She attended the second annual meeting of the National Association of Colored Women. She was the person who wrote the Delta Sigma Theta sorority song, not the words, not the music. She became an honorary member of the Deltas. She led the Equal Suffrage Study Club, being founded in 1914 in Wilmington. She taught at Howard High School for 20 years until she was fired for political activism. Okay. There's a marker outside her home. So when you're in Wilmington, please go by 1310 French Street and you can visit Dunbar Nelson's marker. And the people who live in her home now are very proud of that marker. And it's owned by a man who lives in Newark, but there are tenants and they take care of the marker. Blanche Williams Stubbs. Now, Marlene told me when we were talking originally, she went to Stubbs Elementary School.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And Stubbs Elementary in Wilmington is named for Mrs. Stubbs' son, Frederick Douglass Stubbs, who was a notable thoracic surgeon. Okay. She was a member of the Equal Suffrage Study Club, and she was the president of the Delaware Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. So that's an analog to the National General Federation of Women's Clubs. Both of these photographs of her, one from about 1905 and one from about 1920, were provided to me by her great-grandson, Gordon Fleming, who the family knew about their great-grandfather, Dr. J.B. Stubbs, and their grandfather, Dr. Frederick Douglass Stubbs. They did not know about their great-grandmother, Blanche Williams Stubbs. She was a total dynamo. She was the executive director of the Garrett Settlement House at 7th and Walnut from 1913 to 1949 when the Garrett Settlement House closed. She was just really quite an amazing member of the NAACP, worked with Alice Dunbar Nilsson throughout. Ethel Letitia Cuff Black, who was born in Wilmington, and you will see this is she was one of the founding members of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority at Howard University in 1913. She marched in the 1913 parade on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, and she is featured. On the other side, you will see there is a photograph. It's my photograph, so I'm sorry. It's sort of, with my camera and not a great job there, Anne. But anyway, on the opposite side of the big monument outside where the legislature meets in Dover, you will see if you go up from the bottom row, she's the second person from the left. Blanche Stubbs is on there. Mary Ann Shadd Carey is on there. Alice Dunbar Nelson, of course. But anyway, Ethel Cuff marched in the 1913 parade. She eventually taught at Delaware State University in the 1920s, teaching history and, more importantly, writing editorials about how Black kids needed to be taught Black history. 1923. That sound familiar? Okay. HB 198. All right. Okay. And here in Sussex County, here's Sadie Monroe Waters, who taught. She lived in Bridgeville.
I live in Bridgeville.
Bridgeville. And she taught in Greenwood at the Greenwood Colored School. She's a really fascinating woman, and this is the only photograph I've ever been able to find of her. She was the daughter of a man who had been in the Massachusetts 54th Regiment. He was a drummer boy in the Civil War. And he moved to Maryland after the Civil War to become a teacher and a minister. She grew up in Wilmington. She taught at the Howard School for a little while, and then she moved to Bridgeville. She taught in Bridgeville for probably about 20 years. She and her husband had a little grocery store as well. And she eventually moved to Coatesville, PA, where she became a school principal. But she's buried in Bridgeville at the Mount Calvary Cemetery. So don't forget Sadie Monroe Waters. Her second husband's name was Taylor. And look how long she lived. 99 years. Okay. These women, you may know Mabel Ridgely, and I know some of you were at the dedication of her marker back in June. Mabel Ridgely was the first president of the Delaware League of Women Voters, but she was also the final president of the Delaware Equal Suffrage Association. So all you league folks, she was your first president. So we have a marker for her outside her home on the green, the historic Ridgely home in Dover. That's a photograph of her, the small photograph. And then on the right, the left is Emily Pusey Warner, who there's a school named for her in Wilmington, the Warner Elementary School.
I went there too.
All right. They're following you, Marlene. You're gonna have an alumni wall of fame wall just for you.
Yes, yes.
But she was also a strong supporter of the Delaware Equal Suffrage Association, a president of the Delaware Federation of Women's Clubs, which was at that time only white women, and a great, great supporter of the Women's College in Newark, which at that time, of course, was only for white women. Margaret White Houston. We're in Sussex. I learned how to pronounce the word. It's Houston.
This house, okay?
Pardon?
No, I said, okay.
It's good.
Okay.
So there's her portrait. You can tell from the portrait, a rather aristocratic woman, but it doesn't give you the real sense of her. This marker is outside the Georgetown Public Library. In 1897, when she was 33 years of age and she had 3 little kids at home, she went to the State Constitutional Convention, and she was one of 5 women who addressed the men writing the new state constitution. She gave them a point-by-point, very logical argument about why women should have the right to vote. The 5 of them made their presentations. At the end of the presentation, they were allowed 2 hours. Not one member of the Constitutional Convention asked a question. They were so disappointed. So she started working for suffrage in 1897. This portrait was done when her husband became the Delaware at-large representative in the U.S. Congress, Robert Griffith Houston. So, by the time this was taken, she had a nice fur coat and a few other accoutrements in her wardrobe. Okay. Leah Burton here in Lewis. My husband and I went by this afternoon to see the marker. It's outside the Hiram Rodney Burton home on Ship Carpenter Street here in Lewis. So if you have a chance, you can go by and take a look at it. She was the ratification chair for the effort to get the 19th Amendment ratified in 1920. She eventually married a doctor, Rodney Painter. So, okay. And then we'll finish up with these 2 women, Florence Bayard Hillis and Catherine Boyle. They were both militants. They were both the kind of people. Catherine Boyle was arrested for watchfire protests outside that White House in 1919. Florence was arrested in 1917 for picketing the White House. She came from the Bayard family, very well-known, respected Delaware family, but her brother and her, who married a sister of one of the DuPonts, he married her, one of the DuPonts anyway. They were rabid anti-suffragists. And so she was constantly clashing with her brother about the suffrage question, even well into the 1920s. But here's the thing that I love about Florence Bayard Hillis, that I have to tell you this. I call her the tattooed suffragist. I am not kidding.
Okay.
Respectable society women did not get tattoos in 1914. Just in case you didn't know that, and tell your grandchildren. They didn't get she got a tattoo. And her tattoo was on her right arm, and it said, "CU," not CU as in texting, but C for congressional U. Sorry, U for union, and it was in purple and gold.
Okay.
Now that's devotion.
Okay.
She had and it's in her passport application. That's how I found it. So she's the tattooed suffragist. And you see her talking to a crowd, standing in the back of a car. This is the kind of stuff she did. Catherine Boyle was the daughter of Irish immigrants. She was a working class woman. She lived in Newcastle. She worked in a munitions factory during World War I. She got her picture taken with the National Woman's Party flag. She went to a studio with her best Sunday dress and had her picture taken, and she was arrested also. And we're going to be dedicating a marker to the militants who worked at the steel factory in Newcastle on May 21st. So you're all welcome. It'll be during the Day in Old Newcastle events. And it'll be at 11 o'clock, we'll be dedicating that marker. So, and finally, I put in Eva Robin and Mary DeVoe because they were probably behind the scenes all the time, not always pushing themselves forward. But Eva Robin was the person who really set things up for the Delaware Equal Suffrage Association to begin to press hard to get the 19th Amendment ratified. She was born in Ukraine. As a Jewish woman, she was not necessarily well accepted in the Delaware Equal Suffrage Association, but she had fantastic leadership skills. Mary DeVoe had been involved in suffrage since her college days. And so 2 of them, they're the kind of the foot soldiers, and I thought we ought to see them as well. So I didn't mean to intrude on the other things you wanted to cover, but we have a few more minutes.
I can't believe how quickly, time has passed.
Yeah.
But, one question, we wanted to ask, and I know you've been connecting the dots from the past to the present. So obviously the question is, what relevance does the history we have talked about have to today?
Yeah, and I think that was something that you really wanted to make sure we covered, because we do hear these echoes when we talk about this. When we talk about gerrymandering, and we talk about vote suppression and disfranchisement, all of the echoes, teaching Black history. I mean, these are the things that come back to us. The struggle is not over. As we know, it takes different shapes, takes different forms, but we see how important it is to keep fighting for voting rights. And it's also important to remember, although in Delaware, Black women were voting and they used their votes. You'll see that in the book. They used their votes to achieve some of their goals. But throughout much of the ex-Confederacy, Black women did not get voting rights until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And we now see, these pushbacks. It's also worth remembering that there were other groups of women who really didn't get the right to vote in 1920. Native women living on reservations, Asian-born women who were not allowed to become citizens, poor white women and poor Black women in suffrage states where there were poll taxes. Because if there was a family and they were going to pay the poll tax, they'd pay it for one person, and it would be the husband. And so even in places like Alabama, a lot of poor white women could not vote because they could not pay the poll tax, or the families wouldn't pay it. And in Alabama, at least, the poll tax was cumulative. If you didn't pay it in 1920, you had to pay it twice in 1922, and maybe 4 times in 1924. So a lot of poor women of various racial backgrounds were disfranchised by those kinds of things until the poll tax amendment was passed in the Constitution. And I'll give you one more example, because it's kind of, it used to get my students puzzled. Women, no matter how elite they were, American-born women who married foreign-born men, lost their citizenship. The Supreme Court said that was okay in 1915. So I'll give you a name: Alice DuPont Ortiz. Alice grew up as a DuPont, north of Wilmington in Chateau country. She had a very elite upbringing. She had a lot of money, but she fell in love with a Frenchman. Bad move. Julian Ortiz. When she married Julian, she lost her citizenship. She was no longer an American citizen. Now, Julian promised to get naturalized. And once he got naturalized, she could be naturalized. She had to be naturalized. But for some reason, I don't know what the reason was, Julian waited until 1926 to get naturalized, and then Alice got naturalized. She got her citizenship back. But she was very active in the National Women's Party in Delaware. And of course, there were DuPonts on both sides of the issue in Delaware. But the idea that by being married, you could be, as the Supreme Court put it, voluntarily expatriated is still kind of shocking. My students used to think this was kind of amazing, that you'd have to try to get your citizenship back. Now, of course, men who married foreign-born women, that didn't happen.
Yeah.
But I've probably gone on too long, and I don't want to hold up in terms of the kinds of questions that. Is there anything else that you want to finish up with?
There were two questions, and one I think is significant. I think when people think of women fighting, for the right to vote, we think of the Seneca, convention, and the roots of the inspiration for the mothers of the suffrage movement to do what they did to get the vote are not in American communities. They have Native American roots. So can you talk about that?
I'll just mention that very briefly. Actually, I would say that there are several different backdrops that we need to be aware of for women seeking voting rights. Women in New Jersey who were adult, single, property-owning women, which basically meant widows, they were able to vote between 1776 and 1808 until it was taken away. So there's that as a sort of a backdrop. And then in the 1840s, there are several examples of women petitioning state constitutional conventions for voting rights. So the idea of women voting is kind of in the back of their heads. But there's no question that when women met at Seneca Falls, women and men met at Seneca Falls, to put forward a women's rights platform, a broad platform of women's rights, of which suffrage was one. Lucretia Mott, who was a Quaker minister, had visited the Haudenosaunee women, Iroquois, on a tour as a Quaker minister. And she had been very impressed by the way in which the matrons of the Iroquois Confederacy were able to have a say in the activities of the group. And she wrote about it in letters as she was heading to Seneca Falls. And so we've had Sally Roche Wagner writing about this and trying to call attention to one of these other ways in which voting rights were on people's minds in the 1840s as they gathered at Seneca Falls, as I say, for a broad women's rights platform of which suffrage was part. And of course, Frederick Douglass was at Seneca Falls, and he remained always, as he put it, a woman's rights man.
Okay.
And on that statement, it's inspiring because we have an excellent question from Audrey, and this is Kathleen Baker. And I'm reminded to ask our audience who is present here to concoct a good question. Often a good question is better than a good answer, but that might not be true this evening. I'll tell you what. I'm remembering that at Seneca Falls, there was also the issue of women as property, which came up. And so Audrey mentions this in her question. Is there a relationship of women's concept of being property to the anti-suffrage movement? Is there some sort of through theme there?
Yeah, that's an interesting issue to raise. Let me clarify a little bit about the notion of property. By the time the Seneca Falls Convention met in 1848, 2 or 3 states, including New York State, had passed a law allowing women to keep property they brought into a marriage, including in Mississippi, enslaved people as property. Now, to be very precise, the only women who ever were considered property in a legal sense were enslaved women. White women might be seen as their husbands' dependents, and they couldn't own their own wages, for example, until wage laws were passed in the 1860s. I do think that there's a connection between the idea that women should be subordinate, there should be a gender hierarchy, that men should run families, that women should know their place. I think there's definitely a connection between that and the anti-suffragists' arguments, because the anti-suffragists did not believe that women should be put on an equal footing with men when it came to participating in politics and having a voice in government. Now, on the other hand, some anti-suffragists, and perhaps the most famous anti-suffragist in Delaware was Emily Bissell, founder of the Red Cross in Delaware and of the Anti-Tuberculosis Association. She was a firm anti-suffragist, not because she saw women as unequal intellectually to men, but because she thought that women who had influence in the political system, such as herself, would lose influence if women won the right to vote. You know, as Emily Bissell, as the founder of the Red Cross and so on, she could pick up the phone and call up anybody. And in fact, I went through the letters that she wrote to Senator Willard Salisbury, and they had little nicknames for each other. I mentioned that in the book. So she had a sense that she had influence. Well, once every, Jane and Jill around the state had the right to vote, why would Senator Salisbury bother answering her phone calls? So her sense came from a sense of status, a sense of her importance as an individual, and a sense that she might lose that if all other women in Delaware could vote. So there are several things that go into the anti-suffrage arguments, but the connection between the notion of women as dependents, I think, is definitely strong in the anti-suffrage arguments.
Thank you, Anne.
Mhm.
Wonderful, wonderful question. We have at least 3 questions, and I see some more coming in.
Okay,
So are you game for them? Or
I'm game.
clock is rolling. All right. From Poland, in those states that granted women the right to vote, do we know what the women vote turnout was? Did they exercise their right to vote robustly?
This is something that political scientists spend an awful lot of time talking about, and I recommend Christina Wolbrecht's book on this. The usual argument people made in the 1920s was that, yeah, women turned out to vote after they got the right to vote, some of them, but they really just voted the way their husbands told them to, and they didn't turn out in very large numbers. But we actually are now finding that, and this is kind of a political sciencey thing, in states where there is a lot of party competition, women's vote in the 1920 and 1924 elections was quite robust. It was true in Delaware too. Women registered and voted in substantial numbers. They didn't turn out as quite the same numbers as men, but they turned out in big numbers because there was a lot of party competition. In other states where women had won voting rights earlier, New York State, for example, in 1917, California in 1912, Oregon and Kansas in 1912, Wyoming Territory back in 1869, you can find pretty much any pattern you want to find. If you want to look for women voting the way their husbands tell them to do, then you look at Utah. In Utah Territory, women were given the right to vote, handed the right to vote, because it was a Mormon territory and they worried about non-Mormons controlling the legislature. But in California, there was a very, very strong set of women's organizations. And when women won the right to vote in California, they turned out to vote in large numbers. So there's no one pattern that we can turn to. If you want to find robust voting by women, you can find it. And let me give one example from California, because it's the Delaware connection. A woman named Rose Heizar Duggan, who was born in Delaware, but went to college in California. She went to the University of California, Berkeley. She was participating in the referendum in California, where male voters said, yes, women should have the right to vote. She then registered and voted as a Republican in California, and she moved back to Delaware. And in Delaware, she couldn't vote. She was really annoyed. So she became very involved in the suffrage movement in Delaware. She used to give talks around the state, what it feels like to be a voter. And she would, give the put down to the anti-suffragists who said, women are too delicate or they won't vote the right way. And she was like, I was a voter in California. It's a perfectly easy thing to do. And it is a right of citizenship. Thank you very much.
Splendid, thank you. We have a question from a member of the audience about, is there any distinction among the different religious communities as to suffrage and anti-suffrage?
The Quakers were among the first to endorse women's voting rights. And so you could assume that, and Alice Paul was a Quaker, you could assume that Quakers, you wouldn't find very many anti-suffragists among them. In terms of churches, the one church that was seen as anti-suffrage was the Catholic Church. And it's not necessarily true, but it was bandied about that priests and bishops opposed women's voting rights. And anti-suffragists often looked at Catholics and said, well, those Catholics, they do what their priests and bishops tell them to do, and so therefore you shouldn't give women the right to vote. The Catholic Church took no position on suffrage. Individual priests, monsignors, and bishops would sometimes make anti-suffrage or pro-suffrage statements. And so you find bishops and priests strongly saying there is no Catholic position on suffrage. And it's not something that we would take a position on, but it was understood by a lot of people that the Catholic hierarchy was opposed to suffrage. Now, Catherine Boyle, whom I showed you the picture, she was a Catholic, as was Adelina Piunti from Wilmington, who got arrested. She was the youngest of the Delaware suffragists to be arrested. So, but it probably would take some doing to be able to talk about the different religious groups and try to pin anti-suffrage views on any one.
I just like to make a comment. I'm just sitting here thinking about the question having to do with voter turnout, after the amendment was passed, and putting that in the context of enfranchisement, for African Americans. And what we do know is that whenever African Americans are given the opportunity, to participate, in any aspect of American society, the turnout is huge. So that when the Voting Rights, Act was passed, the voter turnout, on the part of African Americans, was substantial.
Yes.
And as you connect the past to the present, and you look at the, outcome of the 2020 election, African Americans contributed heavily, to the outcome,
Mhm.
particularly African American women. So
Don't
I,
forget to mention that you're wearing your sorority colors,
Ah!
Marlene.
well, one question that we were going to ask was, the role of African American sororities and fraternities in getting out the vote, and they did play a role. And Ida B. Wells, for example, she was a Delta and played a major role in the suffragist movement. And when I think Annie Paul did not want the Black women to march,
To March of 1913, yeah.
Ida B. said, "No, I'm not having it."
Mhm.
But one exhibit that I have that speaks to the impact of Black Greek sororities in getting out the vote is Camilla, who is an AKA. And I have this as an exhibit, not to say that, Alpha Kappa, not to outshine Alpha Kappa Alpha, but just to show how that coalition came together to get out the vote. And this is an outcome.
Right.
And I'm an AKA, by the way.
Alpha Kappa Alpha, Kamala Harris is a member, and the Delta Sigma Theta marched in the 1913 parade.
Yes,
So
yeah.
those are the two. And of course, the numbers were fairly small because the number of Black women going to college was small. But as you say, by 2020, these are really powerful people who work behind to get votes out, as does the League. And of course, some people belong to Alpha and the League. So
Yes. Yes, and do I recall correctly that Ida B. Wells marched with 2 white allies when she slipped into that 1913 parade?
and she marched with the Illinois delegation.
Yeah, right.
Thank you.
But the Deltas marched with Mary Church Terrell, president of the National Association of Colored Women, and they marched in the college section
Yeah,
of the 1913
Yeah.
parade.
yeah.
Thank you. We have 2, I think, concluding questions, which, if it's all right, I'll just try to put into one,
Okay.
which is to say, this is about connections and historical lessons. What about the connection between the push for ratification and then the ERA as we have lived it in our times, and what lessons can you draw from those and generally, and give us some words of wisdom? Thank you. You can go first.
I don't know. I have to work on my wisdom, Marlene. I don't know. Yes, many of you may know that after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, Alice Paul and the National Women's Party devised a new amendment to the Constitution, which they called an Equal Rights Amendment. It had different wording from the one that passed Congress in the 1970s and that Delaware ratified. Paul believed it would bring back the coalition of groups that supported women's suffrage. She was deadly wrong. And what ended up happening was that former suffragists split quite dramatically over supporting an Equal Rights Amendment, largely having to do with what it might mean for working class and poor working women if they were to compete with men on the kind of floor of low wages and so on. But Alice Paul also, and Marlene alluded to this, had very, very difficult relationships with Black suffrage leaders. And couple of the women that I showed you in these slides, Alice Dunbar Nelson in particular, but also Blanche Stubbs, were present in 1921 when the National Women's Party was dedicating that white marble statue with Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And Dunbar Nelson and Stubbs, along with Mary Church Terrell, asked the National Women's Party if they would put forward a resolution demanding that Congress enforce the 19th Amendment where it was not being enforced in the ex-Confederate states. And they did get the resolution onto the floor, but it was turned down. And so most Black women left the National Women's Party. So there were these splits again over strategy and tactics. And the Equal Rights Amendment was one of those things that was actually quite divisive in the 1920s. And to explain that would take more time than I possibly have, but it does have to do with questions of working class women, the needs that they had for protective laws that would at least provide them with a basic minimum wage and things of that sort. And then, of course, the ERA was brought back in the 1960s by the National Organization for Women with new wording, a different kind of wording from Alice Paul's wording. It's a very simple amendment. And it suffered a different fate from the 19th. It fell 3 states short of ratification in the 1980s. There is an effort to bring it back again. I don't think this Congress is going to do anything about it, but one can hope. Keep hope alive.
Keep hope alive and keep action alive, yes?
Well, this is my wisdom. I think that even though this history, shows divisions, across, race lines and class lines, I think when you delve into the history deeply, you will see occasions when diverse people did come together for equality for all. And I think we certainly see that with the Enough is Enough movement, after the murder of George Floyd. And you see people representing various subpopulations, rich, old, young, African-American, Indian, coming together saying enough, is enough. Because if we don't come together, to get this right, as James Baldwin said, God gave no water, but fire next time. So, we need to get this right. And I think people are overcoming their fear and seeing how are the needs and the demands of other people similar to what I want and what I need, in order to live in this country, as a human being and as a citizen.
Actually, now you got me to think of something that sounds like wisdom. These women, you quoted Baldwin, they did carry their history with them. And they were aware of their history. And I think that is something that we need to keep in mind. And that's one reason why having historic markers makes a difference, that people will encounter them on a street perhaps, and they will remember or learn to remember that the struggle for suffrage was a very long and difficult one. And it does continue today in a variety of different ways. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
And all of the sponsors thank Drs. Boylan and Saunders for an illuminating, provocative, and inspiring session this evening. We thank you both for bringing history to light and to this present hour. And we're very glad to say that Dr. Boylan will be lingering to sign books for those who are present. And we'd like to especially to thank our friends on Zoom. It's wonderful to have you here, and we wish you well from Lewis, Delaware, throughout the nation. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.